talking to book people about books and other stuff.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Talking to Book People About Books and Other Stuff. Today I am going to have a chat with Viv Groskop, who wrote the book right behind me called Au revoir tristesse, which is a look at French literature and the happiness it can give us. She is a huge Francophile, huge lover of French literature, amongst many, many other strings to her bow, including stand-up comedy, journalism, author of many different books, podcast, impresario. We're going to chat to Viv about lots of that stuff. Au revoir tristesse, incredibly, is one of two books that she has published during the lockdown period, the other being Lift As You Climb. And so we'll try and have a little chat about that as well. And just about what she's been up to in terms of all these many, many projects and reading and writing, and why French literature might give us a little glimmer of happiness in this weird, weird year. So let's give Viv a call now and have a chat. Super. Viv, thanks so much for joining me and having a chat from sort of quasi-lockdown or not quite lockdown or whatever we call it now. How has it been for you? Have you managed to keep going with normal life? Have you been writing and reading? How has it played out for you?
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster, like I think it has for a lot of people. I feel very grateful that I haven't been personally affected in terms of illness or grief. So I've really tried to do a lot of reading and thinking around the idea of gratitude. You know, I discovered Julia Samuel's book, This Too Shall Pass, which is a wonderful non-fiction book by a therapist about lessons in resilience and hope. That was a real lifesaver for me at the beginning of the lockdown. Then I read Negative Capability by Michelle Roberts, a wonderful new memoir, which is all about trying to really dig deep and find positive things out of negative situations. There's so many great books at the moment that have come out of this kind of serendipitous moment where they seem to have hit a nerve without remotely knowing that there was going to be a pandemic. So trying to stay really positive. Obviously a lot of my work has been hugely affected because I travel a lot, I do a lot of festivals, I do a lot of performing, and I'm surrounded by other performers and comedians and actors and writers who are just so bereft of their face-to-face audiences. So that's hard. But I've really enjoyed some of the online events that I've done. I'm really impressed with lots of bookshops and festivals who are trying so hard to stay engaged with audiences. And there's something that's actually quite intimate about these connections. You know, I've kept my podcast going, How to Own the Room. I've launched a new podcast called We Can Rebuild Her that's all about reinvention. And I've found that the conversations I've had as a result of those have been very intimate and vulnerable and honest in a way that they're not when we're in our normal day-to-day lives, or who knows if they'll ever return.
That's really interesting, the point you just made. Do you think that the conversations that you have on the podcast when you're doing it remotely or is even different to the kind of conversations you might have if you were doing an event or an interview in front of an audience? Do you think because there's no audience there, people are a little bit, I don't know, their guard is down and they're a little bit more open even?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of different factors, and many of them quite unpredictable, because we couldn't possibly have known that this situation was coming. Nobody has ever existed in this situation before. So there's a very interesting vulnerability that people have regarding how they're personally handling this moment and how they feel about personal interaction in this moment, even digitally. And you can really sense that in a conversation with somebody. Also, you speak to them in their personal space. You know, right now I'm in my bedroom.
Exactly.
And, or, you know, sometimes we can see things in people's worlds, and that's kind of interesting. But even when you can't see anything, it's a more personal, subjective view that you get, I think, rather than, I mean, I love the energy of live performance and the connection and the interaction you get when you can make eye contact with people and listen and make people laugh and have that wonderful feeling of gathering that we have. But there's something very interesting about these remote connections that initially I was worried, and I thought they would be very distancing, and I hesitated to continue with the podcast because we've made 7 series of How to Own the Room, and we've had people like Hillary Clinton and Margaret Atwood, Julie Andrews.
Yeah.
And I only ever really wanted to do those people if it could be a face-to-face encounter, because I think you get something very valuable and very different to a phone call. But a phone call or a conversation or a Zoom chat in lockdown is not the same as a Skype call 6 months ago, which was very much like a sort of second best. I think it almost brings something new and sometimes more valuable to an interaction now.
Yeah, and it's, in a way, it's sort of, I suppose, also another sort of slight upside to it is how it's democratized things, because, you know, you can, you know, I'm thinking about this a little bit from bookshops. You know, I know bookseller friends who might be in kind of geographically remote locations who would never necessarily, you know, with the best will in the world from a publisher's side or a particular author, may never get a particular big name author to have a one-on-one chat to. And then, you know, sometimes authors have been dropping in on their book club, you know, in the middle of lockdown, and just sort of hanging out with a group of people in a village somewhere, you know, some obscure corner. And I do like that.
Yeah, I like that too. And I like the idea that it forces you to think, what do I really care about? What do I want to put first? And I think for a lot of authors and publishers in normal life, they're very focused on, when's the book coming out? How much coverage have we got? Where are we getting to? How big is the audience going to be? Is it going to go into the bestseller list? And they have a lot of mechanisms which are very well intentioned, and they're all designed to drive the industry and drive the success of authors and keep books coming out so readers can keep having great books to read. But they sometimes lose sight of the bigger picture, which is that we need local bookshops, we need independent booksellers, we need very, very small parts of this industry, because the smaller parts are often the most meaningful parts. And it's been really interesting to see a lot of people leaning in towards that now that they have a bit more time and space to think about, you know, what I really care about, connecting with readers and keeping really small bookshops going. It's so interesting, which is not to say that, I think often these conversations can be very polarized and very dividing, and people can get very angry, you know, about online book selling and the collapse of hand-to-hand book selling and all of these things that have happened over the last 20 years. And it's almost as if you have to be in a particular camp. You know, you never ever use a certain online bookseller who shall remain nameless.
I like naming them.
Better than that, you know. Whereas now I feel as if there's been in lockdown more of an openness of, let's just embrace everything, let's support everything, let's just keep anything that we can keep going, let's do that. And that's brought a positivity and an openness to publishing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think if there's one thing that, from an industry side, there's one thing that comes out of it, it'll be that online purchase of books does not necessarily just mean Amazon nowadays, you know, and that's been an issue for independent booksellers, even those of us with transactional websites, even those of us with loyal customers. There's still a kind of big default mindset, you know, it's in that direction, and it's been an issue for the chain booksellers, frankly. But both the chains and lots of indies have now sort of entered that space and sort of thought about that a lot more, and as you say, loads of people have given them a try because they just want to support them through this. And then a lot of those customers are, you know, some of those customers will be retained, I think. So anything that can do that is definitely a good thing for the industry. Going from that, what has it been like having a book published during this? Because that is a weird thing.
So I had a book come out on March the 6th, which was called Lift As You Climb, Women in the Art of Ambition, which is really a companion book to go alongside my last book, How to Own the Room, Women in the Art of Brilliant Speaking. And it's all about confidence and finding your voice and being unashamed of the things that you want in life. It's all opening up that conversation. And I did lots of events for that book at the end of February and the beginning of March. And then there came a day where in a 24-hour period, I had about 25 events cancelled and my entire diary emptied. And I did think, how are we going to sell this book?
Dirting, right?
So that was interesting. That book has ended up doing pretty well, I think, because of the success of How to Own the Room, and it already had an audience. And also I've had lots of conversations in lockdown about, what does ambition look like now? Are we going to be changing what our ambitions are? What does it mean for women? All of that. So that conversation is still really, really live and relevant.
Yeah.
Then my next book came out in June, Au revoir Tristesse, Lessons in Happiness from French Literature. And if people are thinking, hang on a minute, how do you write all these books so fast?
Yeah.
You know, that book I really had been working on for about 10 years.
Oh, really?
And you're sort of feeling sorry for your little book in a way, because
Yeah.
you put all of this work into it and you didn't mean for it to come out at a time when lots of bookshops are closed and when you can't get out to festivals to let readers know about it. But at the same time, I just thought, well, you know, this is when my book was destined to come out. I'm just going to have to make the best of it. And it's been really interesting with Au revoir Tristesse, completely unintentionally. Nobody can travel in the way that they want to.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are not going to France this year. I've already had 2 trips to Paris cancelled.
Right.
Like lots of people, I would usually go to France, you know, at least once or twice a year. I would usually spend some of the summer in France. And I feel as if the book has captured some of that momentum of people thinking, oh, I really want to feel immersed in that world, and I can't travel. So I never wrote the book with that intention, but for it to fulfill that at this moment feels really moving for me, and I'm thrilled about it. And for the same reason, it's picked up a lot of coverage. So it's had much wider review coverage than anything else I've ever written. So it had, on the same weekend, the Times, the Sunday Times, the Irish Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Observer, the Mail on Sunday, and it's huge for an author to get.
That's one of the big. It still remains a big thing that does drive people in, you know, into the high street to order copies of the book. And so, I mean, the other thing I suppose though is that you know, the book is about finding happiness through literature, through French literature. I mean, you know, be it either reading it or be it through, you know, the actual stories and that are told. So there's a sort of timeliness to that, because obviously that's a message we've been as a bookselling community sort of pushing throughout this. Tell me about when you first, what was it first all about for you, connecting with French literature?
Well, it's actually very linked to my childhood in the West Country. So I grew up in Bruton, and I grew up there in the 70s and the 80s, and without wanting to be rude to Bruton, which is a beautiful place, it was deadening to me as a child and as a teenager. And I had no internet, obviously, it hadn't been invented yet. I grew up in a family where people did read. There was a lot of reading. My mum was obsessed with Catherine Cookson.
Right.
My dad's the sort of reader who is going to be tearing down your door to get the next Lee Child. But I always felt very kind of closeted and straitjacketed in that environment. And I was desperate to break out and get an education and learn languages and travel. And for me, it was France. And I studied French at school, like most people did in that generation, from the age of 11. And it just became a portal for me of, oh, there's a whole other culture, there's a whole other world, there are all these other writers, all these other books. And it became a world in which I could experiment with a different identity, where I could escape, where I could lose myself. And for me, it was partly through language. You know, I'm a linguist. I studied languages at university. I did 4 languages at school. You know, I love languages. But the writers and the reading were always a huge thing for me, and wanting to get my hands on everything that I could read. I was really into French. I was really pretentious teenager, and I was really into French poetry and Baudelaire when I was about 14. It was so embarrassing, not really. But we all do that, don't we? When we're a teenager, take yourself very seriously, be very dark, and read French poetry whilst wearing a beret. And that was, you know, growing up in Bruton, that felt like something very exotic and exciting to me, and the promise of something so hopeful and different in a wider world. And I was always really keen to bridge that gap that I'd always felt aware of between the kind of reading that my parents did and their love for reading, and the kind of reading that I was accessing through studying French and Russian at university. And this idea that, oh, you have to be very intelligent and very clever to read Proust. And you must make sure that you read the correct translation, because it will be very embarrassing if you were to read an inferior translation. And I always felt, because of my background, just so kind of offended by that way of thinking, and always thinking, you know, books are for everyone. And, you know, as I write in Au revoir Tristesse, you know, writers like Balzac, Flaubert, Guy de Maupassant, these were really terrible people often. You know, they were mostly riddled with venereal diseases. They were with prostitutes the whole time. They were always taking drugs and alcohol. You know, these are not like good, moral, upstanding academic people. These are really kind of visceral, passionate, sometimes almost criminal kind of people. And for them to be elevated onto this pedestal where you only get to access them if you're of a certain level of education, I always hated that. And I love the idea that, particularly in fiction or in poetry and in plays as well, you connect as a reader with somebody whose life experience is completely different to you, perhaps who is dead. You know, that's what I find fascinating about classic works, is that a classic work from 300 years ago can speak to you as if that person is speaking to you as a good friend, and that person is long dead. And thinking a lot about that connection and discovering, rediscovering, I've been rereading Bonjour Tristesse, which I think is a wonderful novella to read for summer. It's just so beautiful. It's only 75 pages long. When you read these books and think about that connection with classic authors and how they shape you as a reader, it's so comforting. You know, it's the most human thing, that experience that we have of being a reader and the connection that it gives us to other people. I really think on some level the thing we're always looking for is happiness, in a very sort of loose sense of, we're looking for a sense of contentment, a sense of someone else understanding us, a sense of calm, a sense of really aliveness. And the French authors, you know, on the surface, Les Miserables, there's in almost every work, there are 12 works that I write about in Au revoir Tristesse, and at the end of each of them some terrible thing happens, whether it's that somebody poisons themselves or somebody gets hanged or everybody dies. And my last book that I wrote about the experience of reading the Anna Karenina fix, Life Lessons from Russian Literature, that's even worse. You know, that's even more full of, on the surface, doom and gloom. But the truth is, these works have endured, I think, because people find universal truths in them about the human condition that actually make them feel better. You know, when we're looking to be happy, that whatever we think of as happiness, it usually means a feeling of well-being, and that things are actually better and more hopeful than we thought they were. You know, that is really why we read. I really don't believe that we read in order to make ourselves more miserable. So the book is an exploration of where can you find these little gems and nuggets of fun and hope, and what is it about these books that appears on the surface to be quite dark and intense, but underneath it there's actually something that is quite innocent and vulnerable and childlike.
What about, because the book is almost entirely focused on the classics, because that's the purpose of it, but at the end you do kind of do a little bit of referencing. Well, there's a couple of things you reference. One is you apologize for the maleness of it, because, you know, we're dealing with predominantly 19th century literature, although actually I think you got to sort of 25% female writers in there, which is not bad for the time. But so there's one thing I wondered about, whether you could just talk quickly about female writers that would be in there if the book had a broader spread, right? You know, if it went more contemporary, and just generally contemporary French writers, if there are any that you're particularly keen on at the moment.
Well, the three writers who are in there who are not men are obviously Françoise Sagan, Marguerite Duras, and Colette. Colette is a tricky one. I think she's much more of a personality than a writerly writer, but she is a classic, and she was regarded on a level with those male writers, so she was essential. There's a section at the back of the book where I name check probably about 30 or 40 modern writers who don't fit into this sort of classical model, but who offer a much more diverse reading experience. And for anyone who's interested in digging into that, one of the best resources is this French prize called the Prix Féminin,
Right.
which is a bit like the Booker. It's been going for about 100 years, and it has an all-women judging panel,
Right.
but they can award the prize to whoever they want. So
Right.
it isn't like the women's prize, which
It's not the
only,
women's prize.
which I'm judging this year,
Yeah.
which can only award to women. It
Yeah.
can be awarded to anyone. And it has a really fascinating overview of the last 100 years of contemporary French writing, where they've awarded to people from all over the globe, because, you know, we forget that as well. This was another really interesting thing to look at in this book, is, you know, the effect of colonialism on the way that we think of language and the classics of a particular language and a particular literature. And so you've got people like François Cheng, who have been awarded the Prix Féminin. There's a whole just go to the Wikipedia page for Prix Féminin, and it gives you a brilliant overview of these authors. Of contemporary, one's Belgian, one's French, writing in French authors who I really love are Amélie Nothomb and Marie Darrieussecq, who have both been most of their work translated into English. And they write quite, I'd say, probably in the vein of maybe Rachel Cusk. So it's quite challenging. It can be a bit tricksy, but very playful and quite funny. There's a book called Truisme by Marie Darrieussecq, which is about a woman who wakes up and she's grown a tail and is turning into a pig. It's that kind of thing.
Right.
And I love that.
Yeah. There does seem to be a lot of breadth at the moment of things we can offer. When I think of sort of, okay, what's out and what's in our shop and is in translation from French, I can think of things across many genres, which wasn't always necessarily the same. It was maybe a stage where you sort of thought more around the classics. So
yeah, I do think that there is a resurgence of interest, and I don't know how it's going to play out now because of the pandemic and all of the other concerns, commercial concerns that people are going to have, but there was a really growing movement towards supporting literature in translation, having more prizes, taking pride in the fact that as Brits we don't buy anything like as much literature in translation as the rest of Europe does, because you know, they buy all of our writers. So it's nothing to be proud of on that scale. But in comparison to, say, the US, where it's really rare to find contemporary works in translation being talked about widely, and we don't do badly, and we were sort of getting better. So I hope that that trend does continue, because it's just so important. You know, it makes you feel like part of something bigger than you are, to know what people are writing and thinking about in other countries.
What do you think is the first thing you're looking forward to doing once life is fully back to normal? What are you missing most now? You know, a couple of months ago I was saying to people, what's the first shop you're going to go? Where's the first coffee you're going to buy? But what is it that you're still looking forward to that's not really possible just yet?
Well, mine is not perhaps that surprising, and it's quite personal, but I really miss stand-up comedy, and I wasn't actually doing that much stand-up when we locked down. I'd probably done maybe 2 or 3 gigs this year. I've been doing a lot more big events around books and meeting audiences that way, but I've been dreaming about stand-up. The last thing I did before lockdown was a gig where we made lots of jokes about, you know, who's going to survive, you know, who's going to be on the list of survivors, and then by 3 days later I felt so terrible about the awful jokes that we made.
Maybe a bit less funny.
And probably we should have cancelled the gig. You know, it was one of those kind of moments in early March. But I really miss it, and I've been dreaming about doing Edinburgh shows and all of the memories that I have of, because that's, you know, I love reading and I love that connection with another mind that you have when you read, but I also love the connection that you achieve in performance. And I really miss it so much, and I know a lot of performers do. I've just written a radio play that is being recorded tomorrow and the day after over Zoom with all the actors on Zoom.
Amazing.
Yeah, and that's going out on Radio 4 in the next couple of weeks. So that's been a really great thing to do, to think, because I thought, how can I provide employment for other performers? How can I get the sense of theatre going? And so I was lucky to get this radio play going, but that's going to be a surreal experience of all of us not being in the studio and not being face to face. And can I give one last recommendation, or I want to know if you've got this? Of course
you can. Always.
The Weekend by Charlotte Wood. I'd never heard of her, to my shame. I love it when I discover a really famous author who I've never heard of, because I'm an idiot. It turns out that, in Australia, this is another really interesting thing. Like, there's loads of amazing Australian writers that we never get to hear about, and New Zealand. And in Australia, Charlotte Wood is a huge phenomenon. And this book, The Weekend, has just come out. She's had a big, really successful publicity tour, so people might have heard about it. It's been on Radio 4. It's been on. She's been interviewed by Mariella on Times Radio. It's about 3 women in their 70s whose best friend has died. And at Christmas time, they have to go to their dead best friend's beach house to clear it out. And they are each harboring a secret that the others don't know about. And just that, the setup of it, as soon as I read the setup, I was thinking, I have to read that. And it really, really delivers on its promise. It's very rich, it's very funny, it's very well observed, it's got a lovely caustic humour to it. But it also has this real incredible sense of atmosphere, because it's at this beach house. It's beautiful.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for spending time chatting, and we'll make sure Au revoir Tristesse is front and center as people can start reconnecting with the shop. Brilliant. Thank you, Viv. Good luck with it.
Good luck to you guys as well, and thank you so much for supporting authors in the way that you do. It's very appreciated.
No problem at all. We enjoy doing it, and we'll see you soon. See you next time you get to Bath.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Please note, no book people were harmed in the making of this film, though some were technologically challenged. All books are available from www.mrbeesemporium.com.